make sure to get to it. And before we get going with our presentation at Royal Roads, we always like to acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the traditional lands of the Kosepsum and the Kwangin ancestors and families. And learning has been happening on the land of Royal Roads for many, many generations, and we're so grateful to live and learn on that land. I also want to just take a moment of acknowledgement for the situation that we are in with COVID-19. I know that all of us are feeling the implications of it in our collective ways, in our unique ways, and of course those in the tourism industry are really feeling it, hence why we're doing this webinar today. So that's what we're here to do, is to collectively help envision a new way forward and be as adaptable as we can in this new changing circumstance. And this also means that many of us are working from home, including both me and Jen. So usually we do our webinars from Royal Roads. We're both doing these from our individual internet connections. So if there is any issues with the audio or video, we encourage you to let us know. We'll be troubleshooting in the chat box if anything does come up, and we have a few tricks up our sleeve to help with the bandwidth. But one thing I will say is if it is your internet and not ours, then just leave the browser, just X out, leave the room, and then come back through a different browser, and usually that'll do the trick. So just to let you know who I am before we dive in, because I will be in the background of it, I am Alana McConaughey. I'm an education advisor at Royal Roads University. We are also joined by a few people you can't see. So we have Tracy Summers here, who's going to answer questions in the chat box if there's any questions to do with programs. We also have Eugene, who is the director of the School of Tourism and Hospitality here. So we probably have some other people in the school. It's quite possible. So just if you hear anybody piping in from the chat box that isn't me or Jen, just know that there's a bunch of people on this call who are here to support this webinar. And with that, we are here to explore crisis management for the tourism industry. And we're so lucky to have Jenn Houtby-Ferguson here with us today. I just want to give you a bit of her background if you didn't read on the invite, or just to refresh. But Jenn is currently working in communications and stakeholder relations at the Canadian Red Cross. And she has an extensive background working in executive level positions in hotel, event planning, and destination marketing. So really a great person to be talking to. And then, of course, her education background is quite fitting as well. So she has a Master's of Tourism Management from Royal Roads with a focus on emergency preparedness and crisis communication, and is currently doing her doctoral work with Royal Roads through our Doctor of Social Sciences program with a focus on risk communication. So she truly is the right person with the right information. And thank you, Jenn, for being here. Just while you turn on your audio, I'm just also going to encourage people to type in where they're typing in from. I see Paula has already typed in. She's coming in from Mission, BC. So yes, please feel free. Type in where you're coming in from, what kind of work you've been up to, anything that you want to share with us. Jenn will be keeping an eye on the chat box. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jenn.
Thanks so much, Alana. Super excited to be here. Maybe I should say, like, full disclosure, Eugene, this feels like a candidacy exam. Eugene is also on my committee and my advisor for my doctoral program. So this is great. Super excited to be here with you. Awesome to see such great representation from all over, which is great. We're going to jump right in here. I'm going to give a little bit of background here in terms of some of my master's research. It was centered around Vancouver Island specifically, but then I'm going to broaden that out. And we're going to talk about COVID. We're going to talk about some of the other hazards that have the potential to impact the tourism industry, of course, but we're also going to talk about that the layering or the compounding effect that COVID brings in this new context. And like Alana said, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. I'm always happy to in person. It's really easy to kind of go with the flow and make sure we get those questions answered. But we want to do this here as well, so please don't be shy. I should also say, full disclosure, I am super passionate about this topic. So I am a bit of a super nerd, and so if there are things that you want to know, I'd be very happy to share them. I have lots of data sets. I did not put lots of data sets into this presentation today, but I have them, and so if you're interested, I'm very happy to share those to you as well. So just here today in terms of kind of a Canadian context, Canada last year welcomed about 22.1 million visitors. And to put that into context, that was a record-setting year, as was 2017, as was 2018. So, we were really on an excellent trajectory in terms of welcoming, close to 22.5 million visitors for 2020. That was sort of the projection. And as you know, the tourism industry is built on small and medium-sized businesses. And so this is a really important layer or consideration as we think about capacity and the ability to respond in this kind of COVID context, but also to be prepared more generally for emergencies and or events that might happen in our communities. I come from the DMO world, or the Destination Management Organization world, or Marketing Association world. And inherently, destinations want to share the good, right? They want to talk about how awesome their destination is and why you should come there and all the cool things that you can do. And what becomes more challenging in this situation is, well, what do we talk about when we're saying right now, please come tomorrow, explore BC later, travel tomorrow? What can we do? So we're going to talk about that today. And I think the other consideration I want you to think about this is that local authorities, and when I use the term local authorities, I'm really referring to municipalities, Indigenous communities, potentially regional districts. That's sort of an all-encompassing term, so please know that it means all of those things. And that typically local authorities don't necessarily consider the impact to the visitor or destination image or destination reputation when we think about emergencies or crises that are happening. Usually the spokesperson is the fire chief. And we have an emergency management person who is speaking on behalf of tourism, or who is speaking and has the potential to impact what happens in their community from an economic perspective. So these are just a couple of examples of, we've seen in tourism, we've had some pretty significant impacts, particularly in the West. And I'll just, give a little credit to my friends in Fort McMurray and in Alberta. They're already experiencing the challenges associated with having a natural disaster or a disaster that's occurring, and then have the layering effect of COVID. We saw last year in significant parts of Eastern Canada, flooding. We saw significant fire activity in Ontario, and of course in British Columbia and Alberta. That fire activity was in 2017 and 2018. Projections for this year in Western Canada, are we going to see increased risk of fire? And of course, we've already seen some flooding impacts and potentially some additional flooding impacts to come in the next week here in BC. So the interior and the Caribou-Chilcotin region have already experienced flooding, and we're looking at some additional flooding potentially in southeastern BC in the coming days and weeks, as well as in the Okanagan. So how do we layer all of that in a COVID context? How do you do a mass evacuation and keep people physically distant? What does that look like? So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So when I did my master's research, the focus, I was really interested in that relationship between destination marketing organizations and municipalities. And again, I use sort of Vancouver Island as my metric, if you will. And what sort of processes did they deploy during a disaster? And so, why does it matter? This is probably my favorite quote, and anybody who knows me knows that I use this on a regular basis. So tourists are more vulnerable, and they are more vulnerable because they are less familiar with the local hazards and the resources. So that means, do they know where to go in a tsunami situation if there happen to be in Tofino? Do they know where high ground is? Do they know where a reception center is in the event that they had to evacuate the community that they were in? And we also have to consider that visitors don't understand the dotted line between jurisdictions. So if we're in Vancouver, they might not understand that, driving a short ways, you're in Burnaby or West Vancouver or, Mission or Abbotsford. They don't necessarily know what area they're in, and therefore they don't know where to go to get information about how to be safe. And so what do? They rely on the DMO to provide that information because that's with whom they have the relationship. And so I think that that's a really important consideration for destination marketers as we go forward. It's an important conversation as it relates to tourism stakeholders. Who's providing what information? And how do we collaborate together with our municipal partners? So who's responsible? This is the million-dollar question in my world. The short answer is everybody is responsible. And if you ask the visitor who do they see as where they're going to get information, they will tell you it's the DMO. The DMO goes like this and points at the local authority. And the local authority says, yeah, it's us, but we're not going to take into consideration the tourism context. Now, I will tell you that that's shifting. We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. But municipalities also want to ensure that residents and businesses are prepared for a disaster. And so the municipality or the local authority also sees a role for residents and stakeholders to play. So that means if you have a hotel, what are your evacuation plans if you had to, leave that property? If you had a fire within the hotel, do people have access to flashlights? Do you have the right equipment within your hotel? Smoke detectors, emergency evacuation signage, that kind of thing. So these are the things we also have to consider. And the local authorities are also all about the preservation of critical infrastructure. So they're less focused on what's the resident doing, what's the visitor doing, and more focused on, how do we make sure roads and bridges are safe, and how do we keep those open and available for emergency services. So one of the questions that I asked during my master's research, and I have to tell you this was fascinating, and it may be surprising to some of you. So I mentioned I focused on Vancouver Island. And if I asked you, and I'm going to ask the question, and we'll see who gets it right. None of my students can participate because they know the answer. If I asked the question, what hazards keep emergency managers up at night? So a hazard is a thing like wildfire, flood, earthquake, tsunami. So remember that I talked to people on Vancouver Island, and if I ask the question to you, what do you think keeps them up at night? And Aiden, I'm going to come back to your question around traveler responsibility. We're going to talk about that. That's a great point. Oh, bears. Good. That's a good one. Not really a hazard, but totally something. Wildlife is definitely a hazard. So Lee is guessing earthquake. Anybody else? Take a second and pop that into the chat and see if you've got any guesses about things that might keep them up at night. Riots, earthquakes. Earthquakes seems to be a common theme. Fires, for sure. Yep. Gonna give people a minute here. Hurricanes, power outages, earthquakes. Preparedness, true, Denise. Yes, the lack of preparedness, perhaps. Okay, so I think you all have a good idea here. I have to tell you that I expected the response to be earthquake and tsunami, and those are the things that go hand in hand, right? So typically you have an earthquake. Very often it produces a tsunami, although not all the time. And I expected on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island, when I asked the question, what are you the most worried about? That's the answer I expected. I expected to hear about earthquakes. And every single one of them said to me, the thing that keeps me up at night is a prolonged highway closure whereby we can't move goods, services, and people. Think about that for a second. An extended highway closure is the thing that keeps you up at night. But if you are in Tofino or Ucluelet, which is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, that corridor, that Highway 4 corridor that goes from east to west, if that's blocked, let's remember we've had some blockages, you can't move goods or people in an emergency situation. You can't move food. You can't move water. The travel of visitors back and forth is impacted. The travel of food, water, fuel, and even if somebody, let's say, had an appendicitis, we can't move them to another hospital to provide that surgical service. So these are very real situations, and the things that sort of compound these things are supply chain impacts. And what we've seen, we've had some pretty significant work that's being done on the Highway 4, for example, where we've seen full day or multiple day closures. And that has had to be very carefully calculated and communicated in and amongst tourism operators, business, the regional municipalities, the tourism industry more broadly. It's very, very significant. And so how do we mitigate against that? Part of that is preparing. Part of that is having a bit of a tree, and we're going to get into some of the specifics about that. One of the key findings that came out of my initial research was the importance of integration and collaboration within between municipalities, within between destination marketing organizations, but also more broadly. So, thinking more broadly in terms of, having that calm and measured approach. Where are we getting information from, and is it credible? So ensuring that if you are a destination marketing organization, and I appreciate everybody is not from Vancouver, but if we did, let's say, if you're looking for credible information and you're based in Toronto, where are you going to seek out information? So you're going to go to the local municipality. You might go to the Center for Disease Control. You might go to public health if we're talking about COVID, and you probably are going to look also nationally. So the federal government has canada.ca/coronavirus, and that is where everybody is. All of the information can be centralized in that location. So credible information is really important. It's also important that we have that sort of calm and measured approach. And so that means that we aren't inflaming the situation. We're talking in facts. We're also talking about facts that relate to our organization specifically, and we aren't speaking on behalf of somebody else. So, for example, if I'm here in British Columbia, I would not be speaking about the situation that is occurring in Alberta or that's occurring in Ontario, except to talk about it in broad strokes, unless I had firsthand information. One of the other key pieces is identifying who your key contacts are and ensuring that you have a plan to connect with them. One of the things that comes out pretty regularly from municipalities is you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. So their focus for emergency preparedness is very much resident focused. And so the question is, what happens to the visitor? Where do they go? What do they do? And what happens if they're on an island? How does that impact your ability to move folks around? So I think that's one of the most important pieces. The other is having a multi-level response and being prepared for a multi-level response. So the ability to scale up for destination marketing organizations, for municipalities, and how are you engaging then, let's say, the regional tourism organization or your provincial or national tourism organization? That is really important. And we also want to make sure that we're sharing what we are doing. And when we talk about a multi-level response in emergency management, that looks like, there may be a local response based on a small event, and then it levels up to a regional or a more regional response, then to a provincial response, and then finally to national, where you're able to engage different resources at different levels. It's the same thing with communications and the ability to scale up and work collaboratively and make sure that you've identified who the partners are that need to be at the table and can provide support to your response. So that might look like public entities. It might look like different layers of government. It might look like other communities or other associations. I'll give you an example. When we had extended highway closures, when I was in Tofino, we built a critical incident protocol. And that protocol engaged our friends and our colleagues in Ucluelet, in Port Alberni. And so there were 3 sort of areas that were directly impacted by a significant highway closure. And it meant that we were all saying the same thing. We were all talking in the same way, using the same language, using the same key messages, so that there was no confusion by the visitor. And there was, on some level, no confusion by the residents. We were sharing that information back to the regional districts and to our colleagues at the Chambers of Commerce. And that was really important and really valuable. As we look ahead to connectivity, this is something that consistently comes up. We saw it in Fort McMurray when we had significant wildfires. We saw it during the 2013 floods in Calgary and in southeastern Alberta. And when we talk about the scaling up, it's a couple of things. It's web capacity. So if all of a sudden, like in Calgary, they were seeing 100 or 1,000 times the volume that would normally go to calgary.ca, people looking for information about how can I be safe? What do I need to do? Am I in the evacuation zone? Where do I go? And we were the right thing. The communications were directing people to one place, but the web couldn't keep up. So what do you do in that scenario? How can we pre-plan for that? We have to think about that. The other is who's your audience. And very often in emergency management, we use Twitter to communicate information. We use Twitter, we use official hashtags. It's a really easy way to quickly communicate information. We also want to make sure that we're using a graphic so that it's less manipulable than would be just sort of a regular Twitter post. But we also have to think about who our audience is. And I think that, this was demonstrated very recently by the unfortunate tragedy that happened in Nova Scotia, whereby the RCMP were using Twitter to disseminate information, but the actual internet connectivity and the audience that they were communicating with didn't have access to Twitter or didn't have widespread internet access. And so that's a consideration. And so, Aiden, to your point around a push notification, like a broadcast message, that is absolutely something. The RCMP is actually now rewriting their protocols with respect to this, just to see, can we do it differently? Can we do a better job? Can we ensure that people get the information that they need? Ironically, the U.S. consulate did share information that they had via push notification with people who were in the Nova Scotia region. And so, those opportunities exist. And the question is, both from a tourism perspective, from an emergency management perspective, from a local authority perspective, at what time do you engage those options? And what type of information are we communicating? What expected action do we want people to take? So these are considerations. Ultimately, what we need is multiple touch points. So it isn't enough to just use Twitter. It's not enough to just use a website. We have to be saying the same thing in different ways so that we can reach all people. And what that might look like is the local authority. So let's say the city of Calgary drafts a message, and we as the tourism industry would just share that message as it is. We might put a tourism lens to it. We might share what is or what is not open, but we would be using the same information. So Natalie, to your question, is there a way to use technology to reach all cell phones locally, even if they are not local phone numbers? Yes, the answer is yes. The technology exists. It does sometimes depend on the carrier that you have. So in Canada, we use a system called, for the most part, it's via Alert Ready, and all telecommunications providers are required to be able to send push notifications to people in a particular geographic region, even if you are not from that geographic region or don't normally reside in that region. So, for example, I was in February and March, providing support to Response in Cornwall. So when we were receiving individuals that were coming from the cruise ships in Japan who were repatriated to Canada, and there were multiple Amber Alerts at that time in that region, and my phone went off in the middle of the night, even though I am from British Columbia. I was in that region, and therefore I got the alert. So that technology does exist and is currently something that's looking to be expanded upon in different ways. So great question. One of the things that research has also indicated, and certainly my work has indicated, is the importance of pre-drafting messages. So in your home country, if you think about, I know somebody said they were from the Caribbean, so hurricanes are a thing. And so how do we think about what kind of messaging, what information might people need to know about hurricanes? They're probably going to need to know where to go. They're going to need to know where the reception centers are, what they should do, putting water in their bathtub or getting inside a central room, staying 3 floors up to make sure that, any storm surge is accounted for. These are the things that you can pre-draft these messages, and then they're ready to deploy in the event that you need them. And part of that can also be identifying opportunities for collaboration with the local authority, with the municipality, with other partners to ensure you're all saying the same thing, especially when something unexpected happens and you don't necessarily have the luxury of time to go through a multi-step approval process. So this provides the pre-drafted messages, acknowledge the situation. There's a Category 5 hurricane coming. Here are the 5 things you can do to be prepared. And maybe you have 3 or 4 messages like that. You've already identified who your spokespeople are, and you're good to go. So you're in a much better position to be able to respond. We also want to make sure that the tourism perspective is considered, and I think that this is a really, really important message. One of the things we saw in British Columbia a couple of years ago was the Friday of the long weekend. There was flooding in a community, I'm not going to name it, in the Okanagan. And so that's the wine region. Typically, that would be a time where it's sort of the official kickoff to summer. The hotels were booked, the campgrounds were booked, the wineries were booked. And what happened was there was flooding in about a 3-block radius. And the fire chief, and I mean this very respectfully, his job was about protecting people and making sure that people were safe. And he stood up and said, "Don't come." And what that did was mass cancellation. Instead, if we had had pre-drafted messaging, we could have had the opportunity where tourism would have been a consideration and we could have mitigated the impact to the economy. We could have had the opportunity to say, this is the area that's impacted, please stay away. And here are the areas that you can go to. Here's what is open. Here is what is safe. And so that collaboration and integration of messaging and understanding the power of those words that community did not recover that summer from those statements because they lost out on that first weekend. Operators were impacted significantly. So just being mindful of those words and who is your spokesperson and have they integrated an economic message for tourism is really key. I want to give you a best practice. Oh, I'm going to flip actually here. There we go. Calgary is open. Calgary did, during the 2013 floods, did this awesome video, and it's on YouTube, and I'm happy to share it if anybody wants it or hasn't seen it. It says Calgary is open, and what they did, they were closed for a period of about 16 days, so 2.5 or almost 3 weeks. And during that time, they were losing in the vicinity of $4 to $7 million a day. It was pretty significant. And the Calgary Stampede, which is one of their biggest events, was about ready to start. And it was like, oh my goodness, we're here in the saddle. Can we get things ready in time? Are we ready as a community to receive people during Stampede? And Calgary, the residents said, look, we're going to make this happen. People came out in droves. They shoveled mud. They made sure that stadium and that area was ready to go, and they turned on their hosting chops, if you will. And this video is so good. So Mayor Nenshi, who continues to be the mayor of Calgary, was their spokesperson. He was the person who came out and said, look, we're open for business. Come on down. Don't be afraid. We're going to enjoy Stampede. Let's do it. And Calgary did not lose market share. They did not lose market share. And when you think about what they lost during that period of time, cancellations of mass hotel cancellations. The downtown core was basically shut down. Huge conventions were postponed. Phenomenal that they did not lose market share. And when we think about COVID, it's not going to be that simple. It's not going to be that simple to just turn things back on. Every region and geography of the world is going to be different. We're already seeing across Canada and across the US staggered openings. What's open and what's not open is different in every province. It's going to look different in every province. So we have to be mindful of that. But I think this is a good example of, being ready, getting all your stakeholders together and being ready to turn things on. It's an awesome opportunity. Another great example is Queensland, Australia. This followed significant flooding and wildfire events that took place from between 2009 and 2013. They established a pretty significant communication strategy, which meant that and was integrated right into their government system. So Tourism Queensland and the Queensland events, Tourism Queensland and Events, which is their sort of corporation, they are integrated right into state messaging, and that is so important. That tourism lens is at the table. What can we do to mitigate risk? How can we ensure we're being safe? But the tourism, a potential impact to the tourism economy is being considered, and that is not always the case. And in Queensland, they've done a very good job of that. And I will say, I'll just add, I was watching this very, very closely. New South Wales and Queensland, as well as the state of Victoria, regarding bushfires this past winter, so December, January, February. And again, Queensland came out with proactive information, regular updates to their tourism industry, where to go for bushfire information. That's an important role for a DMO to play, and I think Tourism Queensland did an excellent job. Okay, I want to come back to the risk. I'm just going to flip back here, but we'll go forward. The risk of inaction, and I think that this is something that in British Columbia, and I would say more broadly in Canada, that we've been guilty of this. And I think hotels have been guilty of this in the past, and no longer can we sit back and just wait and see what happens. If I had a nickel for every time a hotel general manager said to me, Jen, it's just going to blow over. Like, I think if we just let it go, it's going to be fine. Guess what? If we don't tell people what's happening, they're going to make it up, or they're going to choose to go somewhere else. And so we need to make sure that we are really on board. And the potential risk of inaction is damage to our destination reputation, to our destination image, and more broadly to long-term business and return business. Radio silence is not a plan. Even if you don't have all the facts and figures, you need to be able to say, look, I'm going to get back to you with the information, regardless of the circumstance, whether it's a disaster that's impending or whether it's something that's very local to your community. Previously, so when I did my initial research back in 2015, we hadn't yet had the crazy wildfires that we had in 2017 and 2018 here in BC. And what I saw in 2017, what I initially observed was and I had identified actually through my research, was that Destination BC was not integrated or identified in any plans at the provincial level. So every other Crown corporation was identified in the plan. So when I look at reviewing plans in Australia, I see Tourism Queensland identified in those state plans. That was not the case in British Columbia, and that was a detriment during the 2017 wildfires and the 2018 flooding. And so what Destination BC and the province of Ontario um, really took that to heart. I mean, industry came out and said, like, what are you doing? Can you help us? And that there has been a fundamental shift there. So when I look ahead to today, um, Destination BC is very much integrated, and that is a fundamental change. When I look at COVID, they are extremely proactive, and so the proactive versus reactive is really important. But we also have to consider being very, very honest. We have to be really honest about what we are and what we are not doing. We also have to consider the resident perspective, and we're going to come back to that because it's not simple. And we all need to be on the same, we all need to be singing from the same song sheet, but there is a danger in not taking action, in not speaking out. All right, let's go forward here. So where are we at today? When we think about today, as I mentioned, Destination BC has a role to play. They're in the PREOC, which is the Provincial Emergency Operations Center. They're there, as is Parks, BC Parks, and that wasn't always the case. And so now, we have those voices at the table. We have the tourism perspective that is now being considered. And there was a significant recognition last year by the province of British Columbia to integrate or to provide funding to different regions of the province. And that meant that there was an implementation of what's called emergency program coordinators, of which I was one for Vancouver Island. And what that meant was there's 5 of us around the province, and we had the opportunity to train and to engage and to provide support to the regional tourism organizations in BC. And what this meant was the opportunity for significant collaboration. And so there were things like, I'll give you an example. We had the unfortunate situation of a seaplane crash. And that seaplane crash, one of them, was between what would be the Caribou-Chilcotin region and the Tourism Vancouver Island region. And because we were aligned, we were able to connect with one another and figure out who was going to say what information do we have, what do we know. Another example is in the Caribou-Chilcotin region, when we're getting ready to do wildfire evacuations or alerts, Josh, who's the EPC there, was able to say, you know what? There are 3 outfitters or 3 tour operators who have small lodges in this region. Can we be very clear about what the areas are and can they access those properties? Can we mitigate the risk to those businesses and not include them at this time if the risk is low? If the fire is 500 or 150 kilometers away, can we reevaluate that risk? And so tourism was able to provide insight into what's actually in some of those more remote regions. And I think that is tremendous value that the DMOs bring. So kudos to Caribou-Chilcotin Tourism Association as well. Amy Thacker has really been moving this initiative forward. And I think in BC, we've seen great growth, exceptional growth. Destination BC is also doing a lot of research right now as well, and have been over the last couple of years, looking at destination image and how people make decisions related to risk perception. So really, really important. Okay, let's talk COVID. There are a lot of things we need to consider here. A lot of things we need to consider. We have seen really significant cancellations as it relates to meetings and events. In the city of Vancouver, for example, there have already been 48 major event cancellations. And when I say major events, I mean people, in attendance, upwards of 10, 15,000 people. The dollar impact to Vancouver as a destination is significant. Similarly, we've seen cruise ship cancellations. And so again, the daily impact is, $1 to $3 million every day for every cruise ship that comes in. That is a massive impact. So we're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars in impact just in meetings and events, and that doesn't take into account, all the other considerations. There was a recent study Skift did that a third of hotels have laid off all their staff. In British Columbia, we're seeing about 60% closure rate, including some of those really iconic hotels like Fairmont Hotel Vancouver is closed, or the Banff Springs Hotel is closed. And that's about protecting employees and staff, absolutely, but it's also that no one is traveling and their regular markets are not coming. Those international markets are not coming. As of March the 24th, I was hoping I was going to get updated numbers today. They are coming out today. But the United Nations World Tourism Organization estimated tourist arrivals would decline between 20 and 30%. So to put that in perspective, that's projected losses of between 250 and 400 billion dollars, or about 1/3 of global tourism receipts. So that is a very, very significant impact. And when you layer into that 100% of global destinations have travel restrictions, so there are questions around, how are these travel restrictions or border restrictions, how are those going to impact us long term? What will be the perception of risk by travelers thinking about coming to Canada or North America or other parts of the world? How are they going to make the decision, or how are we going to help them make the decision to come? What businesses will actually survive? We're already starting to see some businesses say, look, we can't sustain this. There's been some earlier reports that, some DMOs are reliant on those destination marketing funds, or what in some regions is called the hotel tax or an accommodation tax. There's zero money coming in means that there's zero money for promotion. So what does that look like long term? In some parts of the world, we're hearing that DMOs may close up shop. Looking at the US in particular, 3 months. They can sustain operations for 3 to 6 months, and after that, if there are significant closures, they will not be able to come back. So what does that look like then for those destinations? We keep hearing about a second wave of COVID coming, and in North America, that might look like the fall. In other parts of the world, it might look like next winter or into next spring. Based on sort of flu season and that kind of thing. We also need to consider the concern of residents. And what I'm hearing, and what I just did a talk last week with economic developers across Canada, and one of the things that I heard was residents are really concerned about visitors coming into their community, especially if it's a small community. So more rural, a little more remote, a little off the beaten path. Their residents are concerned about people coming into their community and bringing the virus with them. So how do we balance those concerns as destination marketers or hoteliers, for example, or operators? How do we balance those concerns with attraction of visitors? What does that look like in terms of our promotional messaging? How are we aligning and liaising together? Really, really important conversation to be having. And that means engaging community leaders. It means talking with your local authorities. Again, coming back to that integration and collaboration. The DMOs can't go out and say, come to British Columbia if the residents of British Columbia are not in favor. The experience of the visitor is going to be impacted if we aren't all excited about them coming. And I think that that's a really important piece. We also need to be thinking about how we can let people know that they can be safe in our communities. What are the expectations? What does physical distancing mean in a park? What does physical distancing mean in a restaurant or in a hotel? What impact will the festival and event cancellations have in terms of our ability to get people to stay that extra day? Very often we use festivals and events to leverage people into staying a little longer, spending a little more, and that's gone. It's gone for 2020, and I think that we will see. I think 2021 is still going to be an extremely challenging year. We've seen iconic events like the Calgary Stampede, Pacific National Exhibition, major concerts, all of those canceled, major sporting events, all canceled. So what does that look like for our small communities going forward? Those are usually used as a place to gather together, that sense of pride and pride of place. So I think we need to consider that going forward. Bubble tourism, has anybody heard this term? Give me a little thumbs up in the chat or whatever if you've heard this term. This is new. This is a new term born out of COVID, and bubble tourism is really about, we talk about our family bubble. So you have your family bubble, and then you look at maybe adding another family into your bubble. So in Newfoundland, they're calling that double bubble. So your family can stay within your bubble and meet with one other family that stays within their bubble, and that's the double bubble. Well, in tourism, we're talking about that more broadly. And what that looks like is, for example, it might be Australia as their bubble and New Zealand as a bubble. And those two destinations um, almost operate as one country. And so I think it's really fascinating to see how that will go. They've been able to sort of clamp down. It's kind of a known entity. And so they're looking to have visitors travel between those two destinations. Really interesting. We're starting to see that potentially come forward. Maria, I like that. BC and Alberta bubble, not Washington State. Yeah, I don't think we're ready for the U.S. to come into our bubble. I don't think we're ready for that. But I do think we're going to see this in Atlantic Canada. I think we're going to see it more prominently in Atlantic Canada, New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, for example, where we can control who's coming and going from those two provinces. It'll be really interesting to see sort of how this plays out. Definitely in the short term, we're going to talk a little bit about demand here and new opportunities. We're going to see the focus being on short haul travel, and so really protecting that bubble and trying to mitigate risk. Some of the new opportunities that are coming, and I'm mindful of the time, is the opportunity to pivot into new ways of doing business. And there's a great example of this in Vancouver, where there was a coffee shop that would normally have been like a tourist icon, right downtown, always full of people, lots of business, and right now they also made flour on a regular basis, different kinds of flour. And people, of course, right now are baking bread and other things like gangbusters. So they mill their own organic flour, and they have pivoted their business into selling all different types of flour and have shifted away from coffee. So super interesting. You can still buy your bag of, 1 pound bag or 2 pound bags of coffee, but you're getting that together with your flour, and that's supporting their business. It's keeping their workers going. And so just really interesting ways to kind of rethink. And as a DMO or as a hotelier, how can I promote that? How can I talk about the local businesses that are succeeding and support them? What does that look like? Kind of a different way or a different opportunity to leverage. This is also an opportunity for DMOs to engage in the retail sector. Sometimes that's challenging for us as DMOs. How do we work together? And so I think this is just a really interesting consideration. Can we seek out those really cool and unique opportunities? We're also going to see really big changes in the food and beverage sector, and some of the proposals that have come forward to the provincial government recently include things like everybody wearing a mask. In Canada, that isn't something we've been used to, but man, are we going to get used to it. People are going to see temperature checks when they arrive at a restaurant. They're going to see a lot of plexiglass. They're going to see menus that are not handed to every guest, but actually are sort of a more communal menu, like up on the wall, where people can see their options. We're going to see maybe more limited choices on menus. Interestingly, Cactus Club in British Columbia has shifted their model a little bit. So I think we're going to see that continued focus on takeout and delivery. That model is staying. It's going to be here to stay. But I think we're also going to see, the Cactus Club model, which included things like you could add grocery items to your pickup order. So you didn't also have to go to the grocery store. You could get a few groceries to go along with your takeout dinner. Super innovative, really interesting, and it'll be interesting to see if that sticks for the long term. But I think some of those changes are definitely here to stay. When we talk about demand, and I think this is probably the thing that everybody's like, so when are we going to get back to normal here? What's this going to look like? We are already back to, let's say, 2013 levels. If you remember after 9/11, for those that have either researched or been around since that time, it took us a decade to get back to pre-9/11 numbers. It'll be interesting to see how quickly things come back with or without a vaccine. And I think that the vaccine is really an interesting piece. But what we're seeing is destinations planting the seed for future travel. So we're seeing, great stuff out of Portugal. That now's the time. They can kind of, the tagline just went out of my head, but it's amazing. They're showing this beautiful imagery. Take the time now to plan your trip. So people are doing that. We're seeing that. We're seeing behind the scenes tours. Disney is doing all kinds of awesome things with you can ride roller coasters and you can meet the characters, and they're doing all these really cool behind the scenes things. And I think that that's an interesting piece. July 1st here in BC, I think we're going to start to see some significant shifts. I think we may see some shifts a little bit before then. But Canada really relies on domestic tourism, and I think this is going to explode. I think we're going to see people visiting friends and family. I think they're going to stay in the short haul markets. I think the way that we visit is going to be different. So I think, if we're going camping, there's going to be empty camping stalls. I think if you're staying in a hotel, there's going to be enhanced protocols. And we don't know exactly yet what that looks like or what the restrictions might be in terms of numbers of people, for example, in a hotel. We do know that, for example, on BC ferries, we're seeing reduced capacity, 50% of the number of people who can normally be there, and you are permitted to stay in your car, and there is no food service. So what does that look like long term? One of the challenges right now is if you're driving, let's say, 2 or 3 or 4 hours, where can you stop to go to the bathroom? Because all travel right now is, or sorry, all food service right now is takeout and delivery model. You can't go in and sit in a restaurant. So where can people stop and go to the bathroom if the expectation is that they can get in their car and drive? So these are the things we have to really start to think about before when we think more rapidly about opening the economy across the board. These are considerations. Um, Interestingly, yesterday, so we're seeing already a 40% increase in demand for cruise travel in 2021. I think this is fascinating. Um, Part of that is going to be pent up demand, but in the US, there is also, as of August the 1st, Carnival Cruise Lines has announced departures as of August the 1st, departing 27. They will have 8 of their 27 ships positioned in the US, and those will go out of Texas and Florida starting August the 1st. And if you remember, it was primarily Diamond Cruise Lines, but there were multiple cruise lines, Holland America, Carnival, many, many, many were affected, like a little petri dish. So what new ways will we see what new ways will we see changes in the cruise industry? Really interesting, really interesting to see.
I'm going to ask a quick question.
Abigail, yes,
Yes.
please, yes, go ahead,
No, it's Abigail's question.
go right ahead.
I'll Okay, I'll read it out. So as DMO, we are trying to maintain rate integrity in the destination and looking at value add packaging instead of the accommodations and attractions. Are you seeing similar things in other destinations, or are we at risk of rate cuts that will take years to come back from?
Oh, Abigail, that is the $1 million question right now, my friend. I will say that what I saw post 9/11, post SARS, was packaging. Packaging was a big thing, and we were seeing those value adds, whether it was attractions, whether it was breakfast, whether it was parking, whether it was internet, whatever. And and did that work in the short term? Yes. Yes, it did. Did it attract that short haul market and get them to come and spend? Yes. But could we sustain it for the long term? No. And I will say that other disasters that have occurred since that time, so looking at Australia, New Zealand, the tsunami in Japan, for example, what has come as a result of some of those pieces is those short term kind of discounts or packaging doesn't work in terms of sustaining those guests for the long term. What it can do is put money in the pockets of people in the short term, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I think as a destination, you have to decide: do we want the long-term customer? Do we want our regular customers to come back, or do we need to, have a short-term fix for now and then focus on the long-term guest later? But that's an extremely challenging it's an extremely challenging situation for sure. I think we're going to see some destinations that use this opportunity to scale back the amount of visitors that were coming to their destinations. And I'm thinking specifically in BC anyway about our resort municipalities. I think we're going to see some shifts there. They were already moving towards that anyway.
There's another question from Candace, wondering what your thoughts are on smaller communities with influx of cross-provincial travelers, thinking of communities within the Okanagan and other smaller areas that have sustained with tourism but less healthcare access.
This is a huge challenge. So I think that this is where the resistance from the residents is coming from, right? It's about access to healthcare. Might they bring the disease with them? Would it overwhelm smaller communities? I will say two things. One is from a healthcare perspective, there are plans in place. I can speak to BC specifically. There are plans in place from a BC government perspective to ensure that people who need access to healthcare will get it. Whether they are a resident, whether they are a visitor, we will look after people here in BC. So but I appreciate that initial concern about access to healthcare and additional pressure on local resources, and can we sustain that? So again, I think that that's a conversation that needs to happen within the community with multiple people within the community. And so that means, you've got mayor and council, you've got, so the elected officials, you've got non-elected officials. Can we look at parks and trails? Regional parks and trails largely have remained open. Provincial parks and trails have not. So what does that mean in terms of, again, I'm talking about washroom access, washing hands, the ability for good hand hygiene, additional locations for sanitization, and setting expectations for visitors about what can they expect when they come to your community. So part of that is that proactive communication, pre-drafting some of that messaging now for what does post-COVID look like in your community. Do you expect people to come with a mask? Do you expect them to come with hand sanitizer? Do you expect them to come with an emergency kit? Can you tell them what's going to be open and what's not going to be open? I think those are really important questions. And you're right, Candace. A lot of smaller resort communities also have a larger elderly population. Absolutely. So those are considerations. But I think this is really a bigger conversation about engaging with your local community, with the residents, with elected officials, and trying to balance the economic opportunity or economic risk and their perspective. Because if visitors come and residents are make them feel unwelcome, or we've seen some pretty nasty, I'll say racist comments of people who have come to British Columbia. We don't want that to be what they take away, because that is more damaging to the destination and to a community than otherwise. I think that those are the conversation needs to happen at the community level. I want to just shift gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of planning for the next time, because the reality is we are going to see a next time. And in British Columbia right now, we are focused on fires and floods. I can tell you we had our first wildfire in BC in the Squamish region. We've had significant flooding in the Caribou-Chicotin. As I mentioned, we're preparing for flooding in southeastern BC. So these are things that are coming, and no matter what we do, we have to think about what does this look like in a COVID context. Our friends in Fort McMurray did a pretty significant evacuation. 15,000 people left their homes, and they had to do that in a COVID context. So what does that look like? How do we keep people safe? I think one of the things that COVID has highlighted, at least for me, is supply chain interruption. So where, it's one thing for people to be able to get to your business, but it's a whole other thing for your supplies to be able to get to you. Can you get food? Can you get water? Can we've seen even, access to PPE, or some, even Amazon deliveries have been delayed in some cases by 4 or 6 weeks. So, can you get the things that you need that you normally would rely on? Can you get those more locally? Can we identify different ways or different patterns in order to be prepared? I think the other thing is considering the expectations of government versus the expectations of business. So I talked before about the resident perspective, but we also have to consider, what does local government need? What does local government want? And what does that mean in terms of preparation? What does the loss of destination marketing fees, or what we would call the hotel tax or accommodation tax, what does that mean in terms of the proactive planning? We also have to consider critical infrastructure damage. What happens if, so we're in the midst of a pandemic and now we can't communicate with people and they're stuck at home. So how do we tell them that, or they're stuck in a hotel? How do we tell them to get out and where to go? So these are things that we still have to be thinking about. We still have to be thinking about the hazards that are in our respective regions. So if I'm in the Caribbean, I'm thinking about hurricanes. I'm thinking about mudslides. And sometimes these are compounding effects. So for example, we have an earthquake, a subsequent tsunami, and then as a result of that, there is, loss to critical infrastructure like water and sanitation. Bridges and roads are out. Disease may set in. So there are compounding effects that we have to consider. So really understanding the hazards that are in your region, and if you need help with that, if you're in a region that's not British Columbia and you want help understanding what those hazards are, I'm happy to help identify that for you. But your provincial emergency management associations in your region will certainly have that info. Just want to shift here a little bit and talk a little bit about best practices in recovery, because I do want to leave you here on a positive note. Australia and New Zealand have consistently been best practices in terms of recovery from wildfires, from earthquakes, from you name it. They've mostly seen it, and I think that there are really good examples here. In Australia, East Gippsland this past December actually implemented their bushfire strategy, and they they implemented that extremely quickly. So before any other destination in Australia, because they learned from 2009 when that region was impacted significantly. So what did they do? Um, they talked about where people could go, how they could get here, what was open, what was not open, and they weren't pointing fingers and saying, you don't go over here because our friends over there are having wildfires. Come here instead. No, it was very fact based, very here's what you can expect, here are the highways that are open, here's how to get here safely, and here's where to go for additional information. So they were very much building that relationship with the visitor and being very proactive in communicating with the visitor. And I think that that was super, super beneficial to them. One of the other things that's happening in BC is we've got the BC Tourism Resiliency Network, and I think this is an awesome best practice across Canada. All the regional tourism organizations in BC, each of them are taking a role, and they are disseminating information and support to the tourism industry, advocating on their behalf, helping them understand how they can access federal funds or provincial funds or additional support to pivot to have their business now be available online. So some really super cool opportunities there. So Alana, I'm gonna pause again here and just see if we've got any additional questions or if people have any suggestions, things they'd like to learn more about. Happy to share.
I think from what I can see that most questions have been answered at this point, but I would really encourage, I know we're going to be wrapping up in a couple minutes, so if there are any questions that are left unanswered, then we really encourage you to ask those questions. I also see some people are putting in their business title, and I would encourage you to, this last few minutes, if you want to connect and create community here, put your emails in, connect with each other if you feel comfortable. This has been a great presentation, but I also see there's a lot of people probably that might benefit from keeping in touch and creating a big community as well. So let's see here. Okay, and I see multiple people are typing, so maybe we'll give them a minute and
maybe I'll just
go.
I'll just sort of reference here what's on the screen then while folks are sort of typing in there. And these are just some of the resources. And obviously I made a BC focus, but again, I'm happy to share resources from across the country. I've got lots of Ontario resources and others. On Twitter, there's lots of great folks that you can follow on Twitter. I do reshare and share more broadly. It's also important that you're using the official hashtags, and every province and territory has different official hashtags. So it's important that you're using the right one, and even something as simple as adding an S to floods in BC would make a difference in terms of it being captured or not captured. So something to consider. Oh, Aiden's got a question about the responsibility of the traveler.
I think that was the question.
I was like, oh, wait, I remember this. Aiden, I think you were asking about like what role does the traveler play in this? And so maybe I'll just speak to there is absolutely a role for the traveler to play here. And part of that is researching the destination in advance, understanding, what hazards might they be facing. So being aware of the fact you're going to an earthquake zone. Should you have an emergency kit is the word I'm looking for. An emergency kit in your car? Yes. I carry 72 hours of supplies in my car. I'm a believer in that you should have that. It should be at your office. You should have a grab and go kit. You should spend some time when you get to the destination to understand what the risks are and kind of plan your escape. If you had to leave quickly, same as if you went into a hotel room, what's your escape route? When you get onto an aircraft, I'm the person who gets on an airplane and I count the number of seats so that I know where I am in relation to the emergency exit. I know, and that, just because I'm in row 13 doesn't mean there's 13 rows in front of me. And so there are some really sort of basic things that a traveler can do. One of the other things I usually like to remind people, and my students who are listening in will appreciate this, I try to hammer into them, register your trip with the Canadian government. This is not about Big Brother watching. But if you watch some of those repatriation flights, the folks that were, stuck in Japan on a cruise ship and wanted to get out, they needed the support of the Canadian government to make that happen. There are four or many additional flights, but 4 more flights coming in next week from India, for example. And those individuals were registered with the Canadian government, and it's about the role of facilitating or supporting travelers when they're overseas. And that could be anything from, breaking your leg and needing medical support to or help to come home, all the way to a major pandemic like we've seen, and we have plane loads of people who need to be repatriated. So the traveler absolutely has a role to play here, but the DMO's role is to help educate them. So I think I saw
Claire asked a question around what would you tell students who just graduated or are about done school? I know some of my peers and I are nervous with post-graduation looks like during a pandemic.
So sorry, about jobs. Is that the question? Okay. So this is this is a really tricky situation right now, and I think that there will be opportunities for students. I believe that. I believe that there will be options. There is also something that the federal, so if you're in Canada, that's something the federal government is doing, and it's where if you're volunteering a portion of your time, and that could be liaising, could be certainly working with somebody, working with an organization like the Red Cross. It could be working with an organization like a DMO and providing some support maybe on social media or what have you. If you're volunteering at least 8 hours a week, then there is some financial supports that can be accessed. I do think that we are going to see a little bit of a rebound here in the province of BC anyway. Other parts of the country are reopening. I do think that we're going to see some reopening and opportunities for students this summer. I'll just maybe leave it there. Glynis,
So
what role does
I'm just gonna just note that we're at 1 o'clock, and I just want to make sure, Jen, you have a few minutes. There's a few more questions, so and just letting everybody know that we recognize we're at 1, but of course there's tons to talk about here. So if everybody's okay with it, we'll just keep going for a few more minutes.
Sure. Um, yes. So Dawn actually is a classmate of mine. So this is good. We did our masters together. So good. Just a reminder that the place for tourism industry stakeholders to connect, whether it's with COVID or really at any time, is the regional tourism marketing organization, who in turn then are connected to others. So they're connected to Emergency Management BC. They're connected to Ministry of Transportation or Tourism, Arts and Culture, or Tourism Industry Association of BC, Tourism Industry Association of Canada. That the regional DMOs are a conduit, as are the community DMOs on some level, depending on the scale. But they're the conduit to access other things, other information, other resources. So really connecting in with your DMO is an important thing. Thanks for the reminder, Dawn.
So we have another question from Aiden: how to handle the current negative publicity across the globe for tourism. Everyone is singing the gloom and doom song.
I think, I think this is I don't know that everybody is singing the doom and gloom song. I'm hearing, airlines down, cruises down, the economy is in the toilet, all of these things. But I don't think that we're going to see continued negativity. I really don't. I think people right now are frustrated. They've been at home. They're not sure what this is going to look like. I do think that we're going to see a shift. I absolutely think we're going to see that rubber tire sort of bubble tourism come back, and I think we're going to see it come back sooner than later. The question for me is longer term. When are we anticipating international arrivals will rebound? Right now, Air Canada is projecting the end of December, so the end of 2020. I don't believe it's going to come back that quickly. Based on some of the data that I've seen, I think we're probably looking at the end of 2021, maybe. But I do think that we're going to see. I do think we're going to see some. I think we see some hope on the horizon. Maybe I'll say it that way.
Just seeing a question here that's, looking at overseas tourists who are going to start marketing for 2021 soon, and in your expertise, what would have been the most effective and competitive way countries such as Australia and New Zealand have started to do this?
So it's a good question. The reality is we don't know. We don't know what this is going to look like. I mean, we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like or next week is going to look like. So it's pretty tough to project what's 2021 going to look like. When we're thinking about being competitive, I think we have to talk about what assets do we have? What do we know is going to be here? I'm not sure we know the answer to that. So I think it's about being really honest. This is what we know right now. This is why we're awesome, and just committing to reconnecting with those individuals on a regular basis. So the continued talking is going to be necessary. If I think about BC just as an example, we're talking about the Vancouver Aquarium no longer being part of our tourism infrastructure. And I think that's shocking to a lot of people. And I think we're going to see examples of that throughout across the world. We're going to see some of those iconic attractions go away because they can't sustain financially this length of time that they've been shut down. So I think we just have to be honest about that with our international tour operators and with our domestic partners.
Okay, I think we're up to date on questions and we're just about 5 after. So maybe we'll just carry on. Yes, I will be sharing this webinar, the recording. So everybody who's registered will get the recording. So you'll be able to check it out. And you'll also have my email through me sending the reminder and the follow-up webinar. I'm actually going to turn on my camera now.
Let everybody see you. This is good.
Yes, there we go. Okay. So thank you so much, Jen. That was, I know I speak for everyone when saying that was so informative, and your passion about the topic is so obvious. And of course, you have a consulting firm. I don't think I mentioned this at the front end of the webinar, but you also, in addition to everything else that you're doing, you also do consulting. So your email is here. So if people are wanting to reach out individually, that option is available. Also, if you signed up through this webinar, not through an invite through Royal Roads, we would love to stay in contact with you. We're actually going to be doing a series of these types of webinars where we're going to be bringing on different experts and professionals and talking about how they're remaining adaptive in the tourism industry. We're really going to do our best to create community the best we can and help create this new reality together. So thank you all for being here. And again, that little link at the bottom, stay in touch with us. We would love to hear from you. Also, the Masters of Tourism Management program that Jen did is also a program that we'd love to give you more information on. So you can respond to me.
It's awesome.
Yes, it's obviously very, very helpful, especially on the strategic end. Like
It
that's
is
something that
awesome.
always about this, it's a unique degree and it's something that always catches me out is just
Yes.
like that strategy end that we so need. But yes, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Jen, so much for this awesome webinar.
And just I would just maybe I'll just add thank you so much for having me. And I would just say if you have questions, if there's data you're looking for, you're in a different part that of Canada or somewhere else in the world, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm
Awesome.
happy to share
Well,
what I've got.
everybody stay safe and take care out there. We hope to be in touch soon and have a great day.